You're doing great for 29.
Thanks. Chair, we're ready if you are.
Oh, you just missed the song. Okay, we'll call the June 6th Committee of the Whole meeting to order. Clerk will note the roll. Everybody is present in chambers. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would like to acknowledge that the city and borough of Juneau is on Tlingit land and wish to honor the indigenous people of this land. For more than 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been and continue to be integral to the well-being of our community. We are grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Kunalchish.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We good? We had a little echo.
Yeah, that was just making, it was YouTube deciding to play back for us.
Okay, thank you. Any changes to the agenda, Mr. Manager?
No agenda changes. Thank you.
Anybody? Okay, approval of minutes, February 14th and March 7th. Any objections to their approval? Hearing none, we'll approve those minutes. Agenda topics, first thing, short-term rentals and housing action plan update, Mr. Manager.
Deputy Mayor, Mr. Chambor, the planning manager, is here to give an update on this topic.
Or proceed, we have your, go ahead.
In your packet, you have a series of slides. And page 35 to 40 of your packet is a series of slides to discuss short-term rentals and other housing pressures. Your total packet includes a memo on housing pressure in general with these slides. With particular attention to short-term rental regulations and some examples of regulations in other communities across the country. Also in your packet is housing action plan update memo with some spreadsheet pages of updates in up to 2022 in terms of funding for housing spent by the CBJ. Land use for housing, as well as the policy and land use changes that have taken place in the last couple of years. That information was presented to the Lands Committee in September. And so it's a housing action plan update from that time.
Mr. Chambers, stand by for a second. Mr. Smith has something he wants to say.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I needed to disclose that I have not yet had Airbnb tenants, customers, clients, whatever you call them. But in the near future, I will. I spoke to the attorney about it. And while there is, I will have a personal benefit. It is one, we're unsure of what we're gonna do, but two, that likely any of our actions will be general in nature. And I believe therefore I'm not required to recuse myself, but I wanted to disclose that. Did I do okay, Mr. Attorney?
Anybody have any comments on that? Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Chambers, go ahead. We have your, you have the slides up behind you.
Great, thank you. So I'll start right in, 5 short slides to help set the stage. So basically, in the last year, since there was an update on the housing action plan, there's been a lot of discussion about housing pressure in the community. I bolded a rise in short-term rental use as to be the topic that has gotten the most attention and what we'll focus on tonight. But our office and on social media sites and in conversations throughout the community, there's also been equally concern about increased demand for employer-assisted housing. This community for a long time has had coordinators for certain workforce type industries, whether it's healthcare, legislature, the Coast Guard, a variety of other kind of established workforce needs in the community, but have all come forward saying they're having more difficulty finding housing units to house their folks this year as well. And so with those first 2 bullet points combined, a rise in short-term rental use and a need for more employer-assisted housing, you're also hearing about the decreasing options for independent individuals who may want to live in the community, come back for college, and so on and so forth, whether it's be for rental or purchase. The single family home market is changing all across the country. Housing stock for single family homes is extremely low. I think you've probably seen some of the commentary in Juneau that it's been under 10 single family homes available for sale at some point here in the spring. And a lot of that has to do with multiple factors, changes in the housing market, demand on those projects, and then also COVID related opportunities that people didn't have to work from home in the past. Another topic that we hear a lot about is more concern about a short-term use of housing through Ironman, the large event that's coming in August. It opened up another demographic who wanted to house athletes that they may know or be good stewards in the community to all of a sudden say, hey, there's not a whole lot of housing to provide for these folks. And that seems to be a constant conversation of how to house folks for that short period of time. And then last but not least, all of these other pressures increase the demand for and availability and cost for rentals for the populations that we already know struggle with getting housing in the community, vulnerable low-income households, many of who called our offices about being displaced because some sort of housing is being used for one of these other purposes. So in summary, there's a lot of pressure on the housing stock at the moment and multiple factors for that, as you can see. A lot of this is anecdotal. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the short-term rentals where we actually do have a little bit of information, but not the entire story of how the impact is in the community. And so this is the next slide. Again, so short-term rentals has been a discussion again worldwide for a very long time. It's well known that there are impacts whenever a housing stock is changed into use as a short-term rental. And there's a list of all of the impacts that it can have. Obviously, housing supply, we know, affordability, impact to seasonal housing and availability, public health and welfare issues, nuisance issues, easing or adding to the pressure of tourism, and then coexistence and competition with hotels and B&Bs. There's also, this is a dynamic industry, so there's been an increase in commercial short-term rentals, whether it be hotel operators or folks buying up housing stock to turn into commercial short-term rentals. So it's pretty dynamic and ongoing. Again, what we know about short-term rental use in the community is really limited, but we do know that there are a wide range of impacts. Okay. Sure.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Can you kind of define what makes a commercial short-term rental? Is there a non-commercial short-term rental, and what would the difference be?
So great. So through the chair, so commercial short-term rentals tend to be larger companies who that's their business. A lot of times you see it in places that are destinations with a lot of resort parks or theme parks where it's a kind of a hotel and destination involved. And so the details on those, I don't know of many commercial short-term rental operators here in town, but it could be conceivable if somebody is working under a certain registration for sales tax and using multiple properties in town, that activity could be happening, but I'm not sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, next slide. So this is what we know about short-term rentals in Juneau. Again, I said the majority of our information is through the finance department and the sales tax office. And so they do register short-term rentals. And as you can see in your memo, there's a table of how it's increased over the last 5 years. But in 2018, 147 were registered. And in 2022, it's up to 170 through March 8th, 2022.
Madam Deputy Mayor.
Yep, who's Ms. Hale?
Thank you. Mr. Chambor, speaking of the Ironman, it was my understanding from Mr. Rogers that people who were going to rent two people who are participating in the Ironman had to get a business license and submit sales tax. So would those be included in that 2022 number?
Sure. So through the chair, it's a possibility depending on when the operator, if they're organized to register and wanted to have all their ducks in a row. Anybody who was signing folks up through April 8th could be included. So that could be a factor.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. I kind of have two questions. Number one, what is that 170? Is that owner operator? How is that measured? And secondly, how confident are you in that number? Because it seems like it's a lot higher.
Great. So through the chair, that's a great question. And one of the key notes the operations, they are not calculating whether they're operating multiple properties in this fashion. So it could be higher for that reason. And then also we know that is self-report data. And so people are willingly comply to register. And so it's very difficult to determine on a case-by-case basis if folks are running short-term rentals, but not just registering for sales tax and paying sales tax. So the numbers could be higher for sure. And as we've talked and went to other presentations for organizations or municipalities that have used companies to monitor, once they've switched over to a monitoring service, they've seen numbers increase to their overall registration numbers by as much as 25%. So again, this data is partial and knowingly going into this conversation.
So Mr. Chambor, it's 170 entities that have registered for sales tax, not 170 units.
Exactly.
Each registrant could have 2 or 10 or 20. We don't know. And I also thought there was that the sales tax office was doing some spot checking of looking at Airbnb and seeing things. Is that not the case?
So Madam Chair, yes, that is the case. I think depending on staffing levels at any given time. Again, there are maybe 4 main platforms, but there are hundreds of sites almost these days. So there's a lot of change in the industry. And so I'm not exactly sure what level of screening that the sales tax office or finance staff is doing currently, but they've done a little bit in the past and it's been somewhat difficult.
Okay, thanks. Ms. Dream and then Ms. Huskianis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I don't know how I got this impression, but I am or was under the impression that Airbnb is collecting and remitting sales tax and bed tax for us. Is that correct?
Yeah. So through the chair, we do have Jeff on Zoom, and that would be more likely a comment and a question from the finance director.
Jeff over for that. Ms. Huskianis, do you want to have a question while we're getting him over?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, Mr. Chambor, I'm just, and apologies for the redundancy. I just want to make sure I understand clearly. So I went on Airbnb, just that single site earlier, and there were 295 listings. So you're saying it might be that number being so much higher than 170 could be a mix of 1, people who are not self-reporting, and 2, people who have multiple units, but they're just reporting once.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
How's Mr. Rogers? Did you hear the question?
Chair, I think I heard the question about Airbnb. Can you hear me okay? Just somebody wave and say yes.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So yes, to Assemblymember Stream question, we do not have an agreement with Airbnb at the present time for them to collect and remit sales tax or hotel bed tax. They can. Our understanding is that they do sign agreements with local communities that enable them to collect and remit both sales tax and hotel bed tax on our behalf. The obvious advantage of that is that it would be compulsory then for anybody who uses those platforms to engage in Airbnb services to do that collection. the caution that the sales tax office has always had about that is that most rental owners list on multiple sites. So they are listing on Airbnb and VRBO and maybe Craigslist and obviously a host of other sites. In that event, Airbnb would be collecting and remitting their sales tax and hotel bed tax for their listings on Airbnb, but they would still be required to collect and remit for all of their other rentals on other sites, which we've had some caution about. It seems to be a little confusing for them. It may decrease to some degree our rate of compliance, but Airbnb is definitely the largest player in the environment. And if we sign such an agreement with Airbnb, it would ensure compliance on that level. One of the other concerns has been that we would lose visibility. So Airbnb would then be the responsible party for tax, and we would have even less information than we do currently about who owns and who operates a rental, because Airbnb would simply make one payment, and our understanding is that they don't disclose a lot of information about where that payment is coming from. It's a mixed bag. Certainly, if there was a direction from the assembly to have Airbnb collect our sales tax and hotel bed tax, we would do that. There are upsides and downsides.
And you specifically mentioned Airbnb. We could have such an agreement with VRBO. Is that correct?
I am not aware today that Airbnb or that VRBO signs those types of agreements, but that's something we could look into. Airbnb and VRBO together, I would guess, are 90 to 95% of the rental space.
Thank you. Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Rogers, how does this agreement that Airbnb has, how does that relate to overall online sales tax collection? Because we have a statewide process for online sales tax collection, and is that not happening with Airbnb and VRBO?
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. Assemblyman Hill, that's an excellent question, very nuanced and detailed. One of the things that is interesting is that our law, like other local and state laws around the country, determines that the tax responsibility rests with somebody in the local community. So we consider an Airbnb rental to be a quote unquote local sale, not a remote sale. That is slightly inconsistent in some ways with how we might administer the tax otherwise. But the reality is, the person who owns the unit, the person who is conducting the business transaction, is the owner of that unit. We consider them to be the responsible party, so we consider it a local sale. Many of the Alaska Remote Seller Sales Tax Commission's policies exclude services like Airbnb in the same way that we exclude Uber and Lyft, because we consider those to be local businesses or locally conducted sales. So they're subject to our local sales tax code, and they are not subject to our remote sales tax code. It would take some engineering and some creative thinking to figure out how instead to have Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera, file through the remote sales tax platform. And in addition, we would lose the administrative cost that goes with remote sales tax collection. But it's a really good question, and it's nuanced. It's something that I think that the Sales Tax Commission over time will be forced to wrestle with more and more. But at present, the Remote Sales Tax Commission doesn't take into consideration Airbnb or VRBO because we consider those to be quote unquote local sales, because there's a brick and mortar operation in the community, and that brick and mortar operation is the unit itself.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Mr. Chambor.
Great. So back to the slides again. Again, just to finalize on monitoring the short-term rentals, we have some registration data for sure. It is self-report. It's hard to determine if the owner and operator has multiple units, and the platforms change frequently. So consistently monitoring STRs is going to be a challenge. This slide also talks about the local regulations and in terms of what it takes to register as a short-term
Slide just went away.
rental. State of Alaska requires a business license and refers to local government for sure for additional guidance. Director Rogers talked to you a little bit about the sales tax, bed tax registration, and the table includes the payment from taxes numbers there as well. The land use code does not have a short-term rental definition in Title 49 in its table of permissible uses. But however, the assembly has been poking around additional regulations on this topic. If you recall, the downtown tax abatement discussion last year added an amendment to exclude use of those rentals using the tax abatement for short-term rentals for that 12-year abatement period. So that was an additional discussion.
Mr. Chambor,
that the assembly had.
since you just talked about the bullet land use code, I have a question. You say it does not define it. The one of the main players is whose title is Airbnb, and we do have a definition for B&B in our code. It's under miscellaneous rooms for rent situations, rooming, boarding house, bed and breakfast, single room occupancies with shared facilities, transitional housing, temporary residence. And then it says owner or manager must live on site. And then there's another one for single room occupancies with private facilities. So those are old regulations, old words for before short-term rentals started. And I know this has been vexing for municipalities all around the country. And some have in fact used their bed and breakfast codes, et cetera, to go to regulate these things. So how is it that Airbnbs are not one of these things already? And I understand we can modify it as we will, but how is it that they're not? And this is about land use. Okay, there's different things. There's sales tax collecting, land use, revenue, impacts on neighborhoods. This is about impacts on neighborhoods. So how is it that it's not a bed and breakfast?
Sure. So Madam Chair, again, I think from the historical perspective of CDD, I think if you look again at the table of permissible uses definition, bed and breakfast is defined pretty specifically as a dwelling unit in which more than 2 bedrooms are used for commercial lodging provided by the owner or operator who lives on site. The term bed and breakfast includes boarding houses and rooming houses. So there is a very specific definition over bed and breakfast. Short-term rental use, if you look at the rest of the table of permissible uses, the model is to use all of the forms of residential housing in our code. There are short-term rentals in single-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, B&Bs, hotels and motels. And so it's much more dynamic of a use. And in your packet, you will see that I listed a handful of key highlights for 5 different communities that have short-term rental regulations. And one of the first things that they do is define short-term rental and give its very specific parameters. One of the example in there is the city and county of Honolulu, and they're about to enact their 3rd round of regulations, and it has changed each time. And so the main answer to that response is that short-term rental is not defined in the code.
And how, yeah, okay, we could have a debate on this and a longer debate, and I'd be happy to do that. I'm just saying that there were choices that somebody made to not use this. And I'm not sure how that happened. I had always thought that Airbnb they have been lobbying in municipalities, especially like Hawaii and those kinds of places. And I think we had some tools that we decided not to use, which I understand, but it's not that was not impossible. Other communities have tried, but go ahead, keep going.
Sure. Yes, and just Madam Chair, just a quick follow-up too. I think, short-term rentals, as we know currently, is relatively new. Even the Housing Action Plan does not have language around short-term rental.
Graham has a question.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. This is probably actually a question for you. And of course, you know the land use code and table of permissible uses. I love it. Does our definition for any of these things just want to check if it includes anything that refers to the number of days for a stay, or if it's kind of before?
No, none of the definitions for bed and breakfast, boarding house, because I pasted them all in here. single room occupancy, transition housing, say anything about times
Okay.
that currently. And these are, this is about impacts on neighborhoods. And so there were even different allowances for whether you are with private facilities versus with shared facilities. And the ones with shared are allowed in more places because they're assuming that the person lives on site. So anyway, there's subtle differences in the little numbers in the cells. So it's certainly something that we could stick in here if we wanted.
Can I get a copy of that from you?
You bet. I pasted it into Excel because I found the things too hard to sort. I'll send you the Excel version. And I colored it too. Because I'm a nerd. Go ahead.
Great. Next slide, please. And so now that you kind of know a little bit about what we know about short-term rentals in the community, here's just kind of a quick bullet points of the tools that have been employed in our use. Again, they are not uniform across the country or the world. I did reach out to a bunch of national groups to see if anybody had been creating a clearinghouse yet of all the different rules and regulations around short-term rentals, but nobody's put that research project together yet. And so here's some of the options that municipalities have. Register short-term rentals, register and tax, which we're already doing. Ban and moratorium short-term rentals if it's super impactful in the community. Cap the total number of short-term rentals that are allowable in a community over a year or so. There's one county in north of Lake Tahoe in California that has generated the amount of short-term rentals based on new hotel rooms that are available. So for example, if they create 100 more hotel rooms in the community, they'll allow 100 less short-term rentals in the community. And then other sorts of limits that municipalities can put on based on what impact they're trying to resolve. No entire houses could be used as short-term rentals, only allowable in certain areas of town, number of nights limited, or like the bed and breakfast definition, require a homeowner on site to operate. So there's a lot of flexibility, and those examples are in Appendix B. The next slide. I talked a little bit about companies that monitor short-term rentals. Again, it's labor intensive and difficult because of the dynamic change. The city has been in communication, and at the National Planning Association meeting last month, there was a lot of about 60% of the panels were about housing, and there was a lot of companies available to provide their services. And pretty much what they do is they scour the sites and make sure, again, those registering and following the local ordinances are the actual number in the community. And so the services they provide are short-term rental identification, monitoring and compliance, address identification and deduplication, help with the ease of filing for customer and a little bit of outreach, software and payment services, and the big thing is consistent data for the municipality to have.
Mr. Chambor, Madam Mayor has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Consistent data, what would that refer to? Is there a way we can find out how many nights are used, for instance, for a unit? Okay.
So through the chair, yes. Again, depending on the contractor and the level of service desired, folks provide mapping. And again, because you have the address identification and duplicated, that information will be in-house, and you'll be able to figure out where the big impact areas are, or what types of housing is being utilized for this service most often. Early estimates on just a handful of the folks that we discussed were between 12 and 20,000 a year, depending on the level of services. One thing to note too is these companies do base their services off the local ordinance, and so that usually is the first step, and they cater to wrapping around their services around whatever is included in the local ordinance. And this is the last slide. STRs were not explicitly named in the housing action plan. But like I said, it has been increasingly a dialogue of importance. And so even at the last lands committee, when we gave a housing action plan update, it kind of came up as a medium strategy to start looking into, because there was a sense that it was having impact in the community. And so with that, I can end. In your packet at the end of the memo, you have a couple of recommendations to consider. One of which is appropriating funding so that we could hire one of these service firms to get a real good feel for what is happening with STRs in the community and on a consistent basis. The other is to consider a land use code adjustment to define short-term rentals and go the route to create language that defines what it is and what the impacts are in our community. And then the final thing is just, again, short-term rentals is a hot topic now, but the guidance of developing as much housing as possible from the Housing Action Plan is really, really important, because it would help solve a lot of the issues and needs that were indicated on the very first slide. So don't lose track of continuing your other efforts.
Ms. Hale and then Waha Girak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a comment that what we don't want to find ourselves in, and Mr. Smith was trying to address that with his amendment last year on downtown housing incentives. What we don't want to find ourselves in is a situation where we keep creating housing and then housing keeps getting transformed into short-term rentals. So that's not going to help us dig ourselves out of this hole. So thanks.
Waha Girak.
Yeah, mine's similar to what Ms. Hale just said in terms of, and it's in your report here talking about our grant program for apartment or, you know, rental units. And you also made the note that I think like 8 of them were used as short-term housing, and just wondering if that seems like an easy fix for our grant program to say that, you know, maybe you can only use, you have to rent this out for at least a year or whatever we're considering here, but for a rental housing instead of short-term rental, or you can only use it for rental housing instead of short-term rental.
And thanks for bringing that up. I thought that our $6,000 grant, we already did say you can't use it for a short-term rental. Am I incorrect in that?
So Madam Chair, the conversation where we actually put regulations was the downtown tax abatement. The accessory apartment grant review, we discussed looking at that in the future, but leaving the program as is because it's got two years left on its current iteration. And the numbers actually using it for short-term rental were relatively low, and monitoring that would be a pretty intense level of staffing. So it was at that meeting, we left it as is until the next review. And in like a year and a half now, when the funding runs out.
But we could change our mind.
Sure.
Ms. Tree.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I think you just answered this. We have 2 years left of that program. As I recall that in my conversations with staff about that idea, it seemed like the payoff might not be worth the amount of work it would take to add that requirement if we have only a couple of years left. But I agree with the sentiment for sure. I also I think I'm trying not to jump too far ahead. I have a motion to make, but I think there's other people who want to ask questions, so I'll wait for that.
More discussion on this or questions? Ms. Wall and then Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the kind of future potential options or regulations that's been suggested by the community, or I've seen emails about, is limiting short-term rentals to local or resident ownership. I'm just curious, is that something that you came across in kind of other places, or is there anything that would prevent, you know, a regulation like that? Is that legal?
Sure. Yes, through the chair. And so one of the examples is the recently adopted short-term regulations for Wasilla. and they made it a requirement of an Alaska ownership.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I really appreciate this discussion on short-term housing. When it first began, I was extremely opposed to putting any limitations. I don't like telling people what to do with the property that they own. However, seeing the impact on the community and hearing things like outside ownership has given me pause that we need to look into the deep details of what is impacting our community, because I would hate to negatively impact a family that saw a way of keeping their house or maybe paying for the kid to go to college. We can't judge anybody's financial position why they would do this. The other thing that I would like to, the other point I'd like to make is that this demonstrates the desirability of Alaska. If they couldn't come on a cruise, they tried to come through independent traveling. And so as we were looking for independent traveling matrices, the fact that our community is overwhelmed by visitors and we don't have enough places to put everybody that wants to come to Juneau, that just tells me that some of the marketing's been effective about bringing people to Alaska. The other component that I'd like to mention about this is that the house builders in the community have complained at great length about the problematic, burdensome process of getting property built here in the community. And I think I said that politely enough, but we have a department in the city that is slowing down housing development. I will say that out loud. And so housing is the desire. We are trying to get more housing built. Every single thing that we talk about is more housing. And I think that we might be a little bit in our own way if the people that are building housing are complaining and they're stopped building housing in Juneau. We might be doing some component to get to our solution incorrectly. Thank you for the time, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Ms. Huskanis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mr. Chambor, for that. That was all great information. I'll start because we were talking about the accessory grant loan, and I might need a little bit more specification of the good, why it would be a good reason to let it play out, understanding that you might not get the gains you want from self-enforcing, but I'm just thinking, I don't know why we couldn't put that in there to say you can't use this for that. And I'm going to harken back to Mr. Edwardson. I believe he used to say for some things when we were trying to decide whether to put something in there or not, most people want to do the right thing. And if you tell them not to use it for something, I think, the same way we trust people to self-report, why not say you can't build this and rent it out? You might have some people who are breaking that rule, but probably most people would follow that rule. So I would be in favor of that. I won't jump because Ms. Treem says she has a motion. I guess it's hard for us to make decisions because we are flying blind. And I hope this is keeping sight of the bigger picture of our need to solve the housing problem might inspire us to make some decisions that are going to give us more data, because we don't have that right now. We don't have good, reliable data of, I think the Housing Action Plan says something about a registry, and we don't have that. And I might be misspeaking, but I think the more information we have, then the more conclusive we can feel about we're making the right choice, because we can see what's going on in the community. Personally, I've spent time pestering Mr. Attorney and Mr. Chambor and CDD because I would like to see us take some steps, even though to restrict this. And I guess I'll just say that generally, and I have some different ideas. I think it's a great idea to fund the online service. I've been doing a lot of research on that. I would be down to appropriate some money. I think they do better than we don't have the staff capacity to do. That seems like a real low hanging fruit that we could pick. And then finally, I'll just say I was at a planning commission meeting recently, and it was about a subdivision that will happen above Bonnie Bray that I reported back on. But I think for the old idea that, oh, every house, every unit built is a success because it doesn't matter if I'm moving from my big house into a smaller house because I'm leaving a bigger house that someone else can get. I think at this point, it's becoming clear that that is a fallacy. It is, if I'm moving from a bigger house to a smaller house, maybe I'm turning my bigger house into an Airbnb, or maybe I'm turning it into rental income because that's a solid investment. So I take Mr. Bryson's comments. I do think it is tricky. We don't want to be in the position of telling people what to do with their property too much. But when we have such a housing crisis, I just think with Mr. Chambor's statement that we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to not assume that every unit created, even if we limit short-term rentals, is going to turn into a house that someone can get. And I said that was in my mind, that was the last thing I was going to say. But I'll also add on that I think the CDD is doing a lot of work. And if we're going to regulate this, which I think we should, we need to be mindful of the fact that we just gave them back a position that we'd cut before. And so we need to not continue to ask them to do more and then accuse them of slowing down development when we're not giving them the resources to do the job.
So we have Ms. Hale, Madam Mayor, and Ms. Dream.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I did want to point out, this came up at some point when we were talking about the accessory apartment grant incentive program. It's $6,000, and that actually probably won't even pay the permitting cost to CDD. So it's not very much money that we're actually granting. So I think that's important for us to bear in mind if we're thinking about adding some additional layer of regulation. And if we do add that additional layer of regulation and someone wants to turn it into an Airbnb, they just won't get the grant. They just won't apply for the grant.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Everybody has said great things tonight, and it's a good thing that Ms. Huscanis is the birthday girl because she was a little long-winded.
That's my birthday present.
Yes, it was your birthday present. Anyway, I just want to remind everybody that we are the capital city and we have to be careful about short-term rentals in the summer. This year, they're keeping their fingers crossed. Mr. Smith, I'm sure you're keeping your toes crossed too, that they're not going to come back for special session. But last year we had 3 or was it 4? So we have to remember, as a capital city, we have to play host to the legislatures. And Mr. Bryson's already pointed out that we have lots of independent travelers. So, you know, before we jump into, I would certainly hope that we would go find information first. I don't know what Mrs. Dream's motion is, but.
And I'll just, we've been talking around several different issues and it's getting all smooshed up. Like there's the sales tax revenue thing and are they reporting? But then there's neighborhood issues, which is the land use code. And then there's effect on housing, and they're separate, but all together. So it's hard to know which trail to go down. So we're kind of going down all at the same time. Ms. Dream.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor, and Ms. Huscaini's comments and Mayor Walden's comments are going to be a great segue into my motion. But first, I want to just make a comment that our consideration of Juneau as the capital city goes both ways. Juneau is the capital city, and this is where the executive branch is supposed to be, and this is where executive branch employees are supposed to be. And if we don't have adequate housing, we've already seen capital creep is happening, but especially now as jobs can be located anywhere in the state, if we don't have adequate housing for people who might be potential state employees, they are not going to live here. They'll go live in Anchorage or Fairbanks and do those jobs elsewhere, and we won't get that benefit. So I absolutely agree that we need to keep in mind the housing needs of the legislature, but there's 2 sides to the capital city coin. So that's my comment on that. And then I'm going to make a motion, and my motion would be to direct the attorney to draft an ordinance requiring the registration of short-term rentals and bring that ordinance back to this committee. And I would speak to that and say that I think this issue is really hot in the community right now, and everybody, I think, agrees that we need to know if this is an issue. And the way that we will know that is if we start to count how many short-term rentals there are. This, I think, I want to start with this as soon as possible so that we can start collecting that data as soon as possible. I think we can also then discuss potential regulations of the market for short-term rentals, but none of those would be precluded by just starting as soon as possible with registering those short-term rentals. And there's a lot of communities that have done this already. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel by any means. We can copy. I particularly am a fan of Atlanta's regulation, and their ordinance reads as if Mr. Palmer wrote it. So it's very similar in vibe to a CBJ ordinance. So I would say let's just copy that and replace Atlanta with Juneau. So that is my motion.
The motion, comments or on the motion? Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question for the maker of the motion. Why go for registering, asking people to or requiring people to register as opposed to contracting with a third-party consultant?
I think that those two things would go hand in hand. So we would require registration. My understanding of the services, and I could have this correctly, is we could contract with one service that would monitor and potentially a different service to make that registration process really easy on both ends, on both the owner of the short-term rental, make it really easy for them to do it, and then make it easy for us to collect that information. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, but having that requirement that we register gives us some teeth versus just monitoring.
So at this point, it's just to draft an ordinance and bring it back. So this is sort of a step that we could keep talking about at the next time we talk about this. And also ask our other 10 questions that we need the answer to, but when we talk about it the next time. Somebody's raising their hand. Madam, Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And I'll just state the obvious. Implied in that is we will give you some options on defining short-term rentals, since different people do it differently. And that'll be a fair part of your discussion, I imagine.
So more comments about the motion. Any objection to the motion? Just to Ms. Hale.
Not an objection, just a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I think the question, and I'm not sure if it's the maker of the motion, in theory, people are required to register per se in order to pay sales tax. So this is an additional level of registration, perhaps with more detail. Is that correct, Ms. Dream? Thank you.
Registered the unit and some definition that we'll come back and talk about this again. Okay, so I see no objection to the motion. So what else do you want to know in order to go down this road, this kind of road? Madam Mayor.
Again, we're going to have to know who they are. So I would make a motion to appropriate up to Mr. Palmer, $20,000 to hire one of these firms that they're looking into monitor the STRs.
Okay, you've heard the mayor's motion. Any objection to that? Ms. Dream.
Just a question, probably for Mr. Chambor. Is my characterization correct that there could potentially be two different software programs or services, or do you think that there's one that could accomplish both monitoring and registering?
Mr. Chambor.
Sure, through the chair. So of the four companies that are listed on the slide, they can handle both ends. So basically, once they have, and they can tailor make it to the ordinance that is define short-term rental, who they're looking for, what sites they're trying to find folks, and they take care of it with staff, the whole kit and caboodle.
For the amount that the mayor just said, is that going to be an adequate amount?
So through the chair, we've had a handful of options, and they were all between 12 and 20,000. So 20,000 might be the top end, but again, it might have to be adjusted depending on the definition of short-term rental and that all of the services that might be desired.
And then that comes back here too, Madam Mayor. In the same time we discuss this again. What else do you need to know for the next time we talk about this? Dream.
Do you mean short-term rentals specifically or kind of housing issues more in general?
Short-term rentals specifically. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on the terms of the companies collecting and remitting sales tax, I mean, I guess it seems like I would assume having the company do it, more sales tax would be remitted. I would just assume, because right now someone can put an Airbnb and then just not ever remit the tax. Obviously, we maybe lose some data granularity or something in there, but it seems like we should explore having at least the large companies collect and remit sales tax on behalf of the owners.
Are you making a motion or anything like that? Or you want more information about that?
No.
Okay, so you want to know about whether what's the mechanism for those companies paying the sales tax, and would that be better for us? Is that right?
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, to me, it seems like we should move in that direction. I guess if there's reasons that we should not, then I would be interested in knowing that. But anyway.
Okay, you got that. Ms. Walls.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That brought up another question for me. This amount of money we're appropriating, that's a one-time that's a one-time fee to get a handle on what's going on, or is it a commitment to long-term compliance for the maker of the motion?
I think we passed the motion already, but that's okay. But you could, but she can answer.
I was looking at it a one-time thing because I think as things go on, if we have to use this software, we could do an application fee. And if there's truly 300 units, $40 a fee would pay for the $12,000. It wouldn't be a real big fee to pay for itself.
So at this point, we're just trying to get some data, I think. Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'm not sure I understood Mr. Smith's question, but if he was saying that once we get this information from the required registration, would that then mean we would get that sales tax? I would think that the finance department would use that information to make sure that those people are paying, because that's the kind of thing they do all the time. Thank you.
And the other thing what?
Mr. Rogers has his hand raised.
Okay, Mr. Rogers, did you want to add some information here?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't want to muddy the waters, but I think there is a useful clarification here. So there's a couple of different ways that we would potentially collect tax, both sales tax and hotel bed tax, from owners of for short-term rental owners. One of those ways is what we do now, which is that we say the owner of the unit themselves is the business operator, the business owner. They are the responsible party. So that's the current state, the status quo. Option number two is that we would sign an agreement where we say that Airbnb or VRBO or the technological interface is the responsible party, and they, on behalf of listers, are responsible for collecting and remitting the sales tax and hotel bed tax. So that's a situation where Airbnb or VRBO themselves, as one entity, would make payments to us and file with us to remit their sales tax and hotel bed tax. There's another option, which is that we would use a separate third party that would operate and work a little bit more like the remote sales tax platform, but it would not be the remote sales tax platform. So on a technical level, the remote sales tax platform is called MuniRevs, and it's operated by a company called GovOS. Well, GovOS also operates another platform called LodgingRevs. And what LodgingRevs would do is it would have our owners, the owners who live in Juneau, renting out their facilities, they would file their sales tax and hotel bed tax through a platform called LodgingRevs. But then lodging revs would pass that revenue along to us, but the difference is that would be a mechanism for them to file and pay with us online, but really in principle, the responsible party for taxation is still the rental owner. So there's three
Mr.
kind of
Rogers,
options.
if you could, I think implied in Mr. Smith's question is, what is the best method for collecting sales tax? If you could, outline those or analyze those or decide if you think one's better than the other. I think that was sort of Mr. Smith is wondering whether we should have individuals pay or ask Airbnb to pay, or how that would, or if there's another option for the next time.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I don't know that. I think it's probably a matter of opinion about which is best. There are pros and cons to each. The advantage of what we do now is that the responsibility clearly lies with the Juneau resident who's leasing their unit. So that's the advantage of what we do now. The disadvantage of what we do now is that compliance is difficult. People who rent out their units for short periods of time or on an ad hoc basis may not know what to do. They may not have an easy platform to do that. So there are downsides to what we do today. Having Airbnb and VRBO collect the tax on behalf of their owners would be great in the dimension that we would immediately get to 100% compliance with listings on those platforms, but it might diminish compliance of listings on other platforms. And importantly, we would lose visibility about who's doing how much renting and how much they're paying. So there's a visibility issue, but for those platforms, compliance would be 100%. So that's really a good thing. And then the disadvantage, just to go to the third option real quick, the disadvantage with something like Lodging Revs, which is a third-party platform, a lot like the remote sales tax platform, would be we keep the advantages of making sure that the taxation responsibility rests with the owner. We would keep that, which is a good thing, potentially. But what we would lose is a certain amount of the revenue. Like, that's not a free option. So that option is going to cost us, right? And today we lose between 13 and 17% of all of the remote sales tax we collect. I would expect that we will lose that or more as an administrative charge on sales tax and hotel bed tax if we use something like Lodging Revs. Now, Lodging Revs is not the only option. Mr. Schambor has listed some companies there. Some of them offer to also do this, which is to not only do reconnaissance, not only do registration, but also be the platform through which taxes are filed and remitted. But
Okay, Mr. Rogers,
they all charge.
We're good. We're super good. You can't read the room. But we're super good. Thank you for the extra information. No, you're good. We're just trying to get things we need to know for next time. The other thing I would like to need to know is about the neighborhood issues and the land use issues. Prior to Airbnbs, people had to come and get a permit to get a bed and breakfast in the neighborhood, and neighborhoods came and objected to the bed and breakfast. And now there's just hundreds of neighborhoods, and I'd like some analysis of where they should be, which neighborhoods they might be in. Are we hearing complaints from people in the neighborhoods? I'm not sure. I just don't know. I haven't heard, frankly, that many, but that's a whole other issue, the neighborhood issues. So that's the TPU issue. Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had a quick, Madam Deputy Mayor, sorry. Sorry, Madam Deputy Mayor. So where's the line? We have a very specific law, code in CBJ code that we don't charge sales tax on residential rentals. What becomes the time length that it goes from a residential rental to a short-term rental? Do we have that defined line yet?
That's a good question. So that's another question to add to the questions. Thank you for asking it, Madam Mayor. And I was asking Madam Mayor. I wasn't correcting your Madam Mayor.
Sorry. And my question would be, can we do the same thing if we were interested, what Stella did, that they have to be Alaska residents?
Somebody else here, Ms. Dream. Oh, Mr. Palmer has a comment.
So to answer Mr. Bryson's question, it's 30 days. Anything above 30 days is a long-term rental. Anything less than that is a short-term rental, and hotel bed tax is also applied. To Madam Mayor's question, we have something similar to the concept, and it's the requirement that the owner the property, the place that's being rented, if it's a house, for example, the owner has to live there and occupy it as well. And that gets around a very delicate issue of outside owners, because an outside owner could be a business. Yes, so in areas of our code, as Ms. Deputy Mayor identified, we do have requirements where an owner has to be on site.
It's not happening, but, Ms. Tree, you had a question or you're good? Anybody else? More stuff you want to know? Madam Mayor wants to know how long a break we're gonna have. We're gonna have a 5-minute break, 10-minute break. Okay, 10-minute break. And Wahal Gidok has a motion.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I would move, and I'm going to attempt this here, that management come back to the assembly with a fix to the accessory apartment requirements that make it mandatory use for long-term rental units only.
Okay, so draft an ordinance to do that and bring it back to the same giant meeting. We're going to talk about all the rest of those things. Any objections to that?
Object.
Okay, Ms. Hale.
I'm sorry, I stepped on you. You had your hand up first.
Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Madam Hale. I'm going to object, not because I think this is a bad idea, but I think I'd rather start with the data before we decide who we're targeting for who should be allowed to do short-term rentals and who shouldn't. Thank you.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. And Assemblymember Wahal Gidok, I appreciate the motion and I know we're all trying to get to the same place, but I just think that the fact that we're only giving people that $6,000, which basically doesn't even pay for their CDD permitting or just pays for their CDD permitting. If it were more substantial, then I would think that we might have something of a hook. But given that it's not very substantial at all, I would be in favor of letting that 2-year process play out, as has been said. And then circling back to this and looking if maybe we want to give people more money, for example, to build those units. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. I would object also with the same reason that Ms. Wall had. Thanks.
Any more comments on this? Ms. Huskadis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, the motion refers to restricting what you can do with the accessory apartment. Is that correct?
Yep. It's just yep.
Okay, then I will speak in favor of the motion. And I just want to make the point, although I definitely appreciated Ms. Hale reminding me that it's a very small amount of money, which I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how much it was for. I just want to make the point that it's public money. So even if it's a small amount of money, I think we should consider, and maybe we do, and maybe, I mean, we might do it in other ways, but if we're doing public money in a way that's going to potentially, even if we don't know if it is, potentially affect something we know is a crisis for the community, so someone can make some money, I would say, even if it's a small amount of money, you don't want to put public money into something you know is a problem. We wouldn't put public money into something that we think might be reducing childcare. So I don't know why we'd, even if it's a drop, put a drop of public money into something that might be hurting the housing stock.
And it's $6,000. I don't think it's that small myself. Wahal Gidok and then Mr. Bryson.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate this. You know, I wasn't around for this initial discussion when this was being proposed the first time around, but just from the notes that I see here, at the time, 2021, 8 out of the 27 units are being used for short-term rentals. So that's a significant number in my book, and a significant number that we have the potential to impact and to make some headway on by just one small fix in our grant program.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I see the direction that this is going, and where I kind of see the differences of the two train of thoughts. I kind of see Wahal Gidok's motion as a Band-Aid or a shorter term fix. We're trying to fix just one problem of it. And I think I'm kind of leaning towards, we want the real information. We want the whole problem laid out in front of us. And then we want the solution that works the best for the community, instead of putting one solution Band-Aid on this part of the problem, another Band-Aid on another part of the problem, another Band-Aid, another part of the problem. Let's get the whole problem laid out, get to the very bottom of it, and have the very actual solution for the entire community. And we won't have to come up with all these Band-Aids. It'll eliminate other little motions like this to have the real solution. So I think I'm gonna have to not support this. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. I will speak for it. It's public money. We did it with tax abatement, and the purpose is to create more apartments for Juneau and this is a subsidy. It's not much, $6,000. And I also would urge, let this go forward for now. We're going to talk about it all, but it's $6,000 of public money that a whole good percentage are being used for short-term rentals. And the purpose of the program was to create housing for Juneau. Okay, let's do the vote on the motion. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. So this is on the motion to ask management to bring back an ordinance to limit the accessory apartment to not include short-term rentals. Is that accurate? Walakidak. Okay, Walakidak.
Yeah.
Mr. Bryson,
No.
Miss Hale,
No.
Miss Hughes Scandies,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Miss Treem,
Yes.
Miss Wall,
No.
Miss Gladysevsky,
Yes.
and Mayor Weldon.
No.
Okay. Ms. Dream, did you have something you wanted to say? Oh,
Motion carries 5-4.
oh, sorry. Madam, Ms. Dream.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I just thank you for putting this on the agenda tonight and having Mr. Chambor here. I would like to ask that we continue talking about this more frequently. I agree with Ms. Hughes Scandies that this is a crisis. I disagree with Mr. Bryson that there will be one solution that will fix all of our problems. So I think we need to keep working on it. And the number one recommendation in this memo is to pursue aggressively housing action plan strategies. So I'd like to keep doing that, preferably in this committee, if you will allow it.
Thank you, Ms. Dream. I appreciate that. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I too would like to thank you for putting this on there. We're hearing a lot about this in the community. And I'm just reminding everybody, Ms. Treem told us to read the housing action plan. I read it today and I remembered lots of things that I've forgotten. So it would be worthwhile if you haven't read it to read it.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. Okay, on to the item C, new city hall. Mr. Watt. Or whoever's going to talk.
Item B.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was too optimistic. 1% sales tax. Mr. Watt, we talked about this morning with the mayor and gave some feedback regarding that the list is good, but it's tiny in tiny print and also needs explanation. Each thing, some of these things have explanations, but some of them don't. So we'll need a comprehensive list with explanations. And sometimes there's some things on the top that are also on the bottom. And so you suggested you were going to fix the whole thing and give us a good list to vote on. Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Yes, I've been advised small font size, hard to read, confusing spreadsheet. Other than that, it's great. But
exactly.
So working on a version 2 that'll be more readable, and you'll get a description with everything that's on the list. So the goal for tonight is to confirm that all of the contenders are there. That's really all we're trying to do. So we did outreach to the public and the departments. And I think we have all of the ideas that were submitted to us. So if the committee is happy with everything that's listed, we'll give you something easier to work on and a deadline to submit back your individualized rankings, which will then take up at the committee of the whole on the 27th.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. And I'll repeat what you just said. Thank you, Mr. Watt, for doing a great
Excellent
start.
job.
But I'd like more explanations too. And I don't see anything that was added to the list, although keep in mind the Capital Civic Center group has asked to be removed from the list.
What? To be removed. Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I guess one question I had is just, I have two questions actually. One is, are there projects that the size of which is almost too small to include. And maybe we just deal with that by voting. I don't know if we need to go run down them all, but I don't know how you want to address that. Maybe we just deal with that in voting.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Generally, this list or this funding source has been used in kind of bigger blocks. Doesn't mean you can't do smaller asks, but there are some small ones on there that historically would not have gotten funded. We'll try to categorize it and make it a little more accessible and provide and in there, I think some of these ideas have other options. Excuse me. There were a few suggestions to pursue, notably bonds for either schools and or parks. So that could be part of your discussion. So 5 years of sales tax, I think we got 60.2 million is the estimate. If you can't fit everything into that list, that might be an avenue that you take.
Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have a process question, having not gone through this before. The amounts for each project and the scheduling of when those projects happen, how do those decisions occur? When do they occur? And I ask because I'm just concerned about when we have a project that's going to be in the 5th year, it's probably going to be more expensive than a project in the 1st year just because of inflation. And I want to make sure we're thinking about that when we make our decisions.
The number is generally given by the assembly, but the scheduling is generally staff because they think about all those things like which thing was likely to be later, but we do approve it in general. Is that Mr. Watt? Do you want to add something?
Deputy Mayor, that's correct. And the other thing that can happen, a lot of these projects on the list maybe are multi-year funding. So school facility maintenance or building maintenance would just annually get money. Some of them, Mr. Yucatel has some projects where he's proposing to pursue some grant funds. So he certainly will be grateful for whatever he gets and will apply for grant funds as he's able and come back with funding ideas, however it lines up. So each one is going to have a complicated story. But the funding list will be proposed to the Assembly and adopted annually in the CIP.
I do. Thank you. And the manager hit on it, and that was a possible, bond proposal regarding parks. I've been reached out to by members of the community regarding some turf, track replacement, anyway, kind of a little parks and rec kind of bond package. I guess if we're going to be starting to vote on the 20th, maybe it makes sense to have some of those. I mean, maybe I can be working to craft something and then we can decide how it might work. Just trying to think about voting and while also considering a bond package at the same time. So.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you. And maybe the rest of you know this, but I see that Mr. Yucatel is here and I couldn't figure out where Wayside Park float was. Could somebody tell me?
We can certainly bring Mr. Yucatel up, but at near DIPAC at Salmon Creek.
Super, thank you.
Ms. Dream?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Mr. Manager, can you kind of explain the very tiny table that's in here? I think I can figure out the bottom 2 sections, but I'm not sure what the projects in the top 2 section are.
Mr. Watt?
Deputy Mayor, so recall back to the Saturday work session we had at the Finance Committee. The top section is that straw dog list. And I color coded it green and yellow for the actions that you took. Green are things that you funded. So as an example, you funded $5 million to the Affordable Housing Fund. You may or may not want to provide additional funding in the 1%. So I left it on there. Yellow are 2 that are pending. So the 6.3 for new City Hall and 1.5 for IT systems are, I think, actually on the Assembly agenda for next Monday. And you could act or continue those as you see fit. So that's the top list, what I originally proposed. The next group down are the submissions from departments and the public. And there's some duplication in numbers, but I left those two lists so you could see them. And I think it probably introduces more confusion than clarity. And then at the bottom were those other ideas that the public pitched at us without dollar amount.
So you're gonna massage the list again. Dupe it. And any other questions about this? And you'll get it to us in the next week or something? When do you think you'll get it?
Correct, Deputy Mayor. I think in about a week, we should get you a consolidated list with descriptions. And in the original suggestion, I was suggesting that assembly members would get the scores back by the 20th. We probably have a little more time than that. I have had several discussions with assembly members curious about the timing of the governor signing or vetoing the budget and what that may mean for our fund balance. So it may be preferable for members to have a little more time. So maybe we can try and give you till, say, Wednesday, the 22nd, to do your individual rankings. And then we'll just have to see how the state budget plays out.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. We're moving on to item 3. Like I said earlier, new city hall. Who's speaking? Who's doing that? Ms. Custer. Thank you for staying.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the architect team up to give a presentation on the renderings and the concept of new city hall at 450 Whittier. And after that, it might be a good time to discuss the memo in your packet where we really ask for some decisions from the body. So if you guys would like to come up to the microphone, and I know we have Steve Simpson online as well, we'll go ahead and share the pretty stuff.
Welcome. And if you would identify yourself for the record.
Yes. There we are. I've been zooming too long. So hello, everyone. I'm James Bibb with Northwind Architects here in Juneau, and this is my business partner, Sean Boyle. And I'm very pleased to present online is Steve Simpson with SRS Architecture in Portland. And I want to specifically introduce Steve. Steve worked with us on the Valley.
Where am I? Can you hear me?
So Steve, I'm going to run through the first part of the introduction, and then I'm going to pass it off to Steve to kind of finish out the design a little bit. And then Sean's here to give us a little bit about the numbers. So the first slide I'd like to introduce, it's in your packet there. Go to the next slide here. Oh, there we are. See.
Hey, here we go.
Okay, if we go to the next slide, as soon as you're ready. And we're going to present about 23 slides here, and it's walks you quickly through our process, the conceptual process for the site located in the Auk Village District. So we started looking at city halls around the state of Alaska, specifically in Anchorage and Fairbanks, looking at buildings that represent a strong civic architecture for the community. And we were very pleased to find Juneau's old city hall located up on Main Street. Not too many people know about this. I don't know too much about this. And it shows the city hall back in the day that by itself was a very strong and civic building. And if you go to the next slide, we kind of follow this Anchorage as an example, how they've had at some point to move beyond their existing city hall, their historical one, and create a building that housed all of their departments. So we see this in other communities around the state that are doing similar things. Next slide. I like this sketch. This shows the Auk Village District in a way that reminds us of the civic and cultural buildings in that part of town that are starting to develop. And this is based on a design all the way back in the 60s, where the original state museum was anchored, and they envisioned this place being a location in our community for these building types. So we have K2, the Jack Centennial Hall State Office Building, the new State Library Archives, and in some movement from Clinton and Haida to develop the area. And the proposed city hall is at the old public safety building next to the Zach Teen Center. And we think that's going to be a very beautiful place for this building to share that civic and cultural relationship within our community. Next slide. This is going to walk you through it before Steve comes on and talks about the conceptual design. We took all the program from the department needs, approximately 45,000 square feet. And these are some of the diagrams which we quickly moved to a three-dimensional sort of visual. Next slide. And as we look at that site, we're stacking that program to locate the departments and the spaces best suited for the location. And already on the upper left, you're starting to see the remnants of a public entry or public plaza off the front there in the parking, with the main sort of public programs along the leading edge there. The other view on the right lower there shows the relationship to the Zach Teen Center. Next slide. These are very hard to see, but what we did have done is taken all the department needs of the building and the main public spaces, and we ordered them per floor. So on the left there is our main ground floor with a blue arrow that shows a main entry. The light green spaces, if you can depict those, are the main meeting areas for the building. The yellow is our main lobby spaces. And then the blue there are the department needs that are surrounding the lobby. The red dots there depict sort of the entries to all of these departments. So you're seeing a lot of these relationships on the floor have a clear sort of centralized and easily identifiable access. Next slide. We have to pull this up into section. This simply depicts the main public meeting rooms, the assembly chambers, and the meeting room on the ground floor off of the public plaza or the parking area of the building. The lobby spaces in the middle, and the office program sort of on the surrounding that. We're going to get some great views from this building and from the public meeting areas and the entry back up towards Mount Jumbo, down the channel, across the plaza to the Jack, the Centennial Hall, and K2 and the Slam. The rest of the offices will be in a position which will have great views around to our mountains of Mount Juneau and Mount Roberts. Steve?
Next. Next, please. So James, thank you, James. James walked you through the interior layouts. I'm going to spend a little time and talk about the exterior of the building. But before I do that, I'd just like to show you four kind of stylistically random examples of city halls from around the country. 3 historic and then 1 contemporary down in the lower right-hand corner. They may appear random, but there are similarities. Brick being one of them. Brick gives the buildings kind of a stately governmental quality, but it's more importantly, it's a very durable, long-lasting material. Another similarity is the open plaza that leads to the entrance. City halls are often referred to as the People's Forum, and in many ways, that open space is the people's living room. So it's basically a big invitation mat into the building. And another thing that is very common in all of these is a dedicated assembly chambers, of course. Now, in the historic examples, the assembly chambers is probably buried in the heart of the building and in a lightless, often in a lightless room, natural light anyway. And what's interesting about the modern example down in the lower right corner is that is pulled to the facade of the building, which starts to interact with that facade, giving it an interesting quality that we like. And you can imagine being in a long assembly meeting, being able to turn to your right or left and take in an incredible view, but also have a sense of the changing day, as the light changes throughout the day. And then people that pass by can actually see city government in action. And so we find that to be pretty exciting. And then, of course, the clock is a common motif. Next. So I'm going to take you through a series of diagrams that kind of build on one another, that kind of take in some of these ideas that we're talking about. First, we're starting out with a very simple energy efficient building form, essentially a volume that all 3 floors that James showed you would fit in that volume, roughly 45,000 square feet. In the second image, we're pulling out a plaza which connects to a recessed entrance. Now it's recessed to provide weather protection. And then most importantly, elevating the assembly chambers to the second floor where the views are better, but also it gives it a civic importance. Next. And then as we look down the side of the building, that upper left-hand image, there's a meeting room that's open to the public. And then in the back corner there is an entrance to the garage, which happens to be opposite of the Slam garage entrance across the street. So we're making a deliberate attempt to separate the vehicle traffic from pedestrian traffic for safety reasons. You can see how this, in just a few moves, how positioning these rooms and entrances start to kind of shape the building in an interesting way, which we think is really exciting. Next. So here you can see it on a beautiful snowy winter night with Mount Juneau in the background. Extended plaza, very light and bright entryway, and an active assembly chambers. And the building will glow like a beacon. Next. I talked about brick earlier. Brick, again, gives it that kind of stately governmental quality. But importantly, it's incredibly durable. And the darker the brick, the harder the brick. It's been in the kiln longer, so it's incredibly durable. And we like this brick up in the upper right-hand corner because it's got a texture and a sheen to it that harmonizes with the mountain surroundings. But also the darkness of the brick kind of anchors the building down. And then, as you can see in this lower left-hand image, the light and bright interior, the building starts to kind of glow like a lantern, or that beacon, if you will. Next. And here you can see all those ideas coming together, where it's brick clad, it's a 100-year building, extremely durable, long lasting, easily maintainable. That extended plaza, that recessed entrance for weather protection, the stair up to a light and bright active assembly chambers. Next. And boom, incredible views out down Gastineau Channel, out to Mount Jumbo. View framed by these flanking light controlling curtains that also have acoustical properties. And then at the head of the room, you can see right behind the dais, we have this cutout shape of essentially, which is the city and borough in Juneau. I'm sure you guys all recognize that. And we think we should celebrate that because it happens to be the largest borough, one of the largest boroughs in the country. And it's an interesting shape. And we think it might be appropriate for a wall like that. Next. I'll come back to this room in a second, talking about some sustainability features. So in the city survey that was sent out, we heard pretty loud and clear that a high priority was to make a lasting building, but to make a very energy efficient building. So we're proposing an energy efficient building envelope, high performance glazing, And then the building has this unique southeast exposure. So there's this incredible opportunity to make it solar panel ready, which during construction, we can provide the low cost wiring for a future solar panel array on the roof. And then we fully support the city's requirement for LEED. And then I'd like to bring your attention to the first requirement there as innovation, as I talk about the next slide. Next. In terms of, one idea here is that we can use that large window as a giant solar collector. And we did this on a building down here in Portland, the Multnomah County courthouse that I worked on that just recently finished up. It has a large southeast facing glass window and with radiant piping. And so as the sunlight comes through that window, it heats up the floor, and that radiant piping takes warm water to heat exchangers to cooler parts of the building. And that can also be done with high ductwork in the assembly chambers as well. Next. I'd like to turn it over to Sean now to talk about costs.
Thanks, Steve. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion in the building industry and community now about costs of construction. And I think some of the uncertainty that we have been experiencing has a little time to kind of stabilize, I would think, in the time frame between now and a project like this getting off the ground. A couple of things I wanted to point out in the design that was presented is it's a good synthesis of very simple forms and high quality materials and high quality strategies in terms of performance of the building to get at what makes a good civic building in today's climate in terms of architecture and economy. And you can cheap it up on smaller pieces of the project, whether it's facade material or interior finishes or things like that, but you're not going to gain a whole lot in the long term relative to the cost of construction and the cost of ownership of the building over the long term. So we're trying to be pretty real about the numbers. We've escalated these numbers 2 years out at a slightly higher than normal escalation rate to cover our uncertainty in the building economy right now. And that's gotten you a construction cost of $28.4 million for the building, the 3-story structure. With that goes a development cost. That's your owner management component, the design fees, a fairly sizable contingency to hedge those uncertainties in potential bidding. That brings your number up to $37.9 million for, again, the 3-story building. Part of this discussion included whether we put parking under the building. So like the State Museum and Library building across the street that has a whole level of parking below that structure, we included in this conceptualization and cost estimating the cost of doing that here, which does push that parking level floor down into the tidal zone and the gravels in that area. So that is part of that added cost, is dealing with that complexity. That cost escalated with the development costs applied to it is $3.3 million for a total project with the basement parking of $41.248 million. So that's a starting point for discussion as to whether, as to how one may scale back a large building like this that consolidates all of your program needs. It's I think it's a fairly accurate figure in terms of what we're looking at. Next.
We have a question. Mr. Bryson has a question.
Thank you. As I was looking at these very beautiful pictures, I love the big window. I can't wait to stare out of it one day. How tall are the ceilings? Because that assembly chambers, even with it being 2 stories, look significant. What are the ceiling heights for the three stories?
That's something James and Steve can address.
Yeah, at each floor, we're about 13 foot floor to floor. So the assembly chambers would probably be about 20, by the time mechanical ducts and whatnot, the ceiling gets lowered about 20 feet up.
I want to add that, keeping in mind that you have interstitial space between the floors in every building. So if you have a 10-foot ceiling, like you may have close to in here, that's probably 3 feet above this floor for ducting line. So that's additive. The other thing that we didn't really talk about is in that design as presented, that is putting the building up on about a 3-foot plinth, because we're trying to offset some of the depth of bury for that parking in that lower level. So clearly, if the building did not have parking underneath it, that height may come down. Still want it elevated above the street a little bit, but that overall height may come down a little bit.
Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I hope I'm not getting ahead of things here, but a question for maybe Director Custer. The graph in this memo of assembly chamber use that shows the many days each month that the chambers are used, and the presentation we just saw, does that mean that you're kind of walking back on the recommendation to not include the assembly chambers in the building?
Ms. Kester.
Assembly Member Treem, you're correct. The memo talks about a lot of feedback that we've gotten from user groups on using assembly chambers offsite. So the first item on the list of recommendations for you, the easiest decision is to discuss and confirm that assembly chambers should, whether or not assembly chambers should be included in the facility. Certainly, it's still up to you. There's a lot of pros and cons, but that's kind of where we landed.
Let me ask you guys, are you done with your presentation or do you have more?
I was just going to, in the next slide, there are a number
Okay,
of items
yep, go ahead.
But I did want to point out that I think as one were you're launched into the next step on project. You bet. If you were to launch into the next step of development of any project like this, strategies for addressing concerns about costs are appropriately addressed. And the question of whether this parking, or the question of whether you have the assembly chambers as a part of this, or if you conceivably could reduce the overall need for space by consolidating this facility. Going to take all EBJ employees and put them in one place. Are there efficiencies in that? That's the kind of thing we can't get too far into at this stage of design development. And we didn't want to take a guess at that. So we basically designed the building to include everyone. So.
Madam Mayor has a question.
Thank you. So the brick looks beautiful, probably be pretty weather resistant, but how much is that adding to the expense, or will it pay for itself with maintenance? Do you figure why we're using brick, or what's your advocacy for brick?
I'll speak to that first. One is longevity is a big one, of course. The cost of construction is we can make metal cost a lot of money too. Okay. And to do a metal building, like a metal clad building in this environment, to have the same type of longevity, it would probably rival the cost of brick, if not be significantly more, because you have to deal with corrosion resistance and isolation of dissimilar metals, utilizing metals that don't have the breakdown and corrosion that you find after Kynar coated sheet metal starts to fail and rust. That's a cost that you have to factor into that long-term ownership, is replacing it or recoating.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Hawk.
Yeah, thank you. The 37.9, does that include the assembly chambers in the current building? And then also wondering about, furniture, all the things, is that also inclusive in that number?
Take this in two slides because the 37.9 does include the assembly chambers. It includes all program components that were given to us to work with. except for that parking level. That was a different discussion. Furnishings, I don't recall whether furnishings were incorporated in the development cost. And I might turn to Jean on that because you recall if we. Yeah, typically. Thank you. Yes, typically when you have that development cost, it's the FF&E budget is incorporated with that. But we were using a percentage base to develop that rather than picking apart, how much that table is going to cost. Couldn't get to that level of detail at this level of design.
You want to talk about this level of design, just so it's just a kind of a one step above a crayon. I mean, we're sort of starting to pick apart your thing, and how much should we do that? I mean, how, right?
We could have gotten to these numbers with no drawings at all and gotten a fairly accurate perspective on what this is. However, our directive was to develop some imagery that would go with those numbers to give people an idea of what they'd be getting, because not everyone just reads numbers and understands what we're talking about, or looks at a floor plan diagram and gets numbers based on what we're talking about. But what we're finding is our concept level numbers are sometimes closer to the final cost of the project than many of our numbers in between concept and bid day, which is my glib answer on this. We put an awful lot of effort into trying to home in on estimated cost over the course of design, but I'd say 4 out of 5 times on a project, it seems like the best number that we ever had in the whole process was our initial concept estimate.
Madam Mayor and then Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate all the work you've done on doing energy efficiency and possibly conservation. The windows, especially the solar heat collection, is especially intriguing, especially after the last couple of weeks we've had in Jena. We all know our house is heated up quite a bit. Does that include air conditioning? Just kidding. But I was wondering, does the price include the solar panels, or are you just prepping it for that to happen? And then if we decide to do solar panels in the future, that would have to be an extra cost.
Great. As Steve mentioned in his portion of the discussion, this is for solar ready. It's including doing some background to support solar in the future, whether that's a combination of electrical wiring and roof structure. But no, it doesn't include the solar, which we did get an estimate for in our effort. But it really wasn't our task to provide that piece. That was on our own reconnaissance, if you will.
Just like to, as we're talking about next steps, let the committee know that lots of these details of, is it brick or is it metal? I mean, this level of design is so very conceptual. It's really just to be able to bring a cost estimate to the voters. And as the last slide mentions, there's a lot of refinement of design that needs to happen, a lot of conversation on parking. So, while this is great to have a pretty picture so that we have a vision of what it could be, it's so very far from details like, are there solar panels, or even is it brick or is it not? So just to ensure the committee and the public that we haven't committed to any of those details at this point.
Thank you. That's why I asked a question about cartoon, because I want to jump into, is it 2-story glass? I'm refraining. Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam
On my
Deputy Mayor.
on my list. Then
I-
Mr. Smith.
I have that temptation as well, but also since we have you guys here, I think it kind of makes sense to ask some of those questions. Mr. Boyle, you alluded to a question I have long wondered about, and that is the ability or risk to build underground parking close to the ocean. And I'm wondering if I think you alluded to the fact that it'll cost a little more because of that. And I'm wondering if there's still any risk, like we're going to pay a little bit more if we do the underground parking, but that eliminates any risk of, I don't know, flooding, I guess, or we pay a little bit more and we're like pretty solid that we're all good. Does that make sense?
Mr. Put your microphone on, Mr. Boyle. No, it's not on.
Sorry, I shut it off by accident. Sure, I guess an easy way to answer that is to look at some of the other buildings in town that have made this move. Sealaska Heritage Center has their archives in their basement, which is also in a tidally influenced zone. So they've been very successful in controlling that thus far. The state wasn't willing to take that kind of risk with treasure box of the state. And so they put the parking down there because cars are replaceable, artifacts are not. And of anything you put in a basement in that zone, I wouldn't want to put the mechanical system down there, but putting cars down there, you can drive them out if you have a problem until you can resolve the problem. So it's a fairly low risk strategy in the end, because what's down there isn't as important as most other things in a building.
Well, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. What do we know about the trends of the commercial office space market in Juneau?
Okay, so that is a good question. Can we ask these guys their questions and then we could get to that? Okay. Because then they don't have to sit here through a whole.
Oh, very good, very good. On underground parking, does that prohibit the use of a ground source heat pump?
I think the area of the site is what prohibits the use of a ground source heat pump effectively. I mean, you could put those wells below the parking in the basement. And in theory, it probably would be a better bet to do it that way than under other building program, because if you ever had to get at any of the couplings and connections in that well field to address a repair, you could tear up a slab in a parking garage, no big deal. But doing so in somebody's office would be a bit more of an issue. I think the building site is a bit small for that. And I think that what we know, we love ground source heat, but it has an added premium. And I think that the way we were looking at this building is it would be an air source heat pump system. It would be a highly efficient building envelope. So your energy demand is going to be fairly low relative to most commercial structures. And then you're using a fairly well-vetted technology to extract heat out of the atmosphere and put it in the building. For a cost that's significantly less than drilling 25 wells and pipelining them together. If you had a large site with a lot of room, it's a lot easier to do. You can get the space between the wells. Unfortunately, our current ground source heat pump technology doesn't let us go down below 400 feet or so without taking extreme measures for each well. So there's a simple mathematic kind of layout that you have to deal with to get the spacing between wells at that maximum depth.
More questions for the architects. Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't going to ask any detailed questions, but just because you said you had a quote on the solar, do you remember what that was or?
Yeah, the unescalated quote for it was almost 1.9 million.
Thank you.
So from our standpoint, well, it seemed a little high unless you had some kind of federal grant to cover it. And we've done this in town before. If you look at the Trillium Landing project out in Vintage Park, that's the senior apartment building that has a full rooftop solar array. And that was a subsidized, government subsidized move on that developer's part. And because they did that, they got other financial benefits within the building. We did calculate that at the time that was installed, the cost that the panels were at that time, it had about a 45-year return on the investment to do it. So it seemed like a lot even for a private development, but the folks paying for it didn't have a problem with that. Keeping in mind that for a municipal entity, your buildings are almost eternal, so as long as the technology is good enough to outlast its return date, great. And I just want to assure you all that I'm doing most of the talking here. James or Steve, if you have anything to say, jump in. But we're all really excited about this project, and we're all happy to answer any level of detail questions that you have if we have the answers for you. So.
Any more questions for the architects? You good? Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the drawings. And I'm sure we'll be asking you more questions later. Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I would suggest turning to your page 3 of 4 of your memo on the new City Hall update and tackling the questions in this recommendation in the order presented to you. I think they're really listed with the easiest decisions first. So instead of kind of going over all the points that I brought up in the memo, I thought maybe we could arrange the conversation per recommendation. And that might be a good way to prompt conversation or questions that you have from the memo. So the first recommendation is to discuss and confirm that assembly chambers should be included in the facility.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move that the assembly chambers be included in this facility.
Any objections to that motion? Okay. I lost my paper. It wasn't stapled, so now it's all a mess. Okay,
Oh, sure.
thank you.
That was done. I'll do this one.
Madam Mayor.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. And I would also move that the underground parking should not be included because we are looking at trying to help with the North State Office Building parking, and that might present some of our own solutions, and that just shaves off money on the project. And it solves Mrs. Treem's worry that saltwater might get to her car.
Ms. Treem.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have an objection for a question and then possibly also maintain my objection. And I am just curious from the engineering standpoint, it's possible and it's cool that it is possible. Can you add parking after the fact? I guess I'm a little concerned that for a building that we plan to be perpetual, that we're making the parking decision based on short-term factors.
I found it. Ms. Kester.
Thank you for that question, Assemblymember Treem. You can not add parking underneath the building after the fact, but certainly there's lots of surface parking in that area. And as we mentioned, there's the possibility of North State Office Building parking garage.
Okay, I would maintain my objection then because I think that ideally surface parking becomes something else in the future. I don't think that that's the highest and best use of any surface lot we have. And so we shouldn't make this decision based on what will hopefully be a short-term availability of parking.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was at a chamber meeting last week when Senator Keel discussed $5 million from the state to CBJ for that North State Office Building Garage project. So I think, and perhaps Mr. Manager can speak to that, because I think that is 5 million. I was right in line with Ms. Treem because I do not agree that we want to use surface area for parking. But if the intent is, as Senator Keel talked about, basically the north part of that state office building parking lot, it needs to be demoed, but possibly even raising that even all the way up to Calhoun Avenue, and the parking being multi-use. So could be used by the public, could be used by the city, could be used by the state. So if we were talking that, I would be in favor of this. I do completely agree with Ms. Treem that we don't want to use, we want to reduce the surface area parking there. So I don't know, Mr. Manager, if you could speak to that at all.
Mr. Watt.
Deputy Mayor, so indeed there is 5 million that came out of the legislature to Juneau for that project. That's not going to be enough to do a parking structure project. It's going to require other funding. It's on our list for 1% sales tax. The fund advisors, the capital fund advisors at the Community Foundation have interest in providing funding for that, as they see it would benefit the legislature. It'll take a while to develop that project. And I think the general idea here on the new City Hall project is put your eggs in that basket. It's not to say it's the only strategy. you could, if you were okay with the added cost on the new city hall project and adding underground parking under the new facility, that's a perfectly good option as well.
With your motion.
In reality, both projects will take a while to develop. And they probably won't develop all at the same time. So I don't think there's a wrong answer here. And maybe it depends on how cost sensitive we are on the city hall project.
Madam Mayor, once you have your motion comment?
So I made the motion just because I'm following this, but I think this is going to be a long-term discussion and I would object to my motion to keep it on the table still, just so you know.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I thought I saw somewhere where this was going to create about 40 parking spaces. And in looking at parking garages that we've built before, other downtown parking things, I had the anecdotal knowledge that a parking space costs around $80,000.
Right.
If you do the math, that's about where we're at. So if we create a parking space in another parking garage, it's going to be about $80,000. We create a parking space on the street, out of street that wasn't already there, it's still going to cost about $80,000. And this was over a couple of different parking spaces. And you just do the math, divide how much the parking garage costs, how many spaces you got. So I would like for us to continue this discussion. Thank you, Madam Mayor, because I think that even though I like Ms. Treem's thinking about what is the future going to mean for transportation in Juneau, that we've said that we want this to be a 100-year building. We want this to outlast all of us. Having a vacant space that is used as a garage right now under the building, it would be more advantageous than not having the space in the future, even with whatever direction parking moves. And since this this underground is at about that same 80 grand a space, it's not above what it would cost for us to create a parking space somewhere else. It's still in that same ballpark range. So if we're going to still continue talking about this, then I'll stop. Thank you for the time.
Madam Mayor.
Okay, I think it'll make this simpler for everybody. I withdraw that motion. I make a second motion. I move that the underground parking should still be included in this project for discussion until we get to a later date.
Any objection to that motion? So we just didn't didn't decide again. No, not really. I have a question about the cost, Mr. Watt. Parking spaces are expensive. And if all things being equal, it's going to cost us the same to dig it underground as to add to the other thing, that would be one thing. But is Mr. Bryson's notion correct that it's going to be the same no matter which one we do? It seems like digging under the building is kind of expensive, but probably adding to the other building is expensive too. So I don't know.
Deputy Mayor, Mr. Bryson's assessment, it's not unfair. It's not an exact analysis, but a parking space is going to be 19 feet by 8.5. It's nearly 10 by 20. It's nearly 200 square feet. And you need each parking space takes some circulation room and stairwells and elevator space. And by the time you net it out, 400 or 500 square foot of parking space, might be 70,000, might be 80,000. It's going to be a similar cost in both locations.
There.
I'm just trying to move us along. So
please.
This will be a little tougher one. I would move that we continue this discussion and not put this general obligation bond before the voters on the October 2022 municipal election. And if you allow me, I'll speak to my motion.
Go ahead, Madam Mayor.
I think this is a really cool project and I think there's hope for it. And thanks to Northwind Architects, it's a beautiful building. Like I said, great idea on the energy efficiency and everything else, but I don't think we brought the public along. And so I don't think they're quite ready to vote on this. We still, as Ms. Kester says, there's still some fine tuning we need to do on all of this. And we still need to decide whether we want parking or not parking. So, and quite frankly, when the voters are unsure, I don't want to put on the election that the same our 1% sales tax is also on. So I think we need to have some time to bring the public along a little further. And I don't want to compete with 1%. Thanks.
Any comments on the mayor's motion? Ms. Treem.
Thank Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Just a question, and that is about the immediate needs for maintenance in this building. And if we push this back a year, which I think the mayor makes some good points for doing, what does that mean for how much money we should be spending on this building?
Mr. Watt or Ms. Kester?
Thank you for that question, because we absolutely need to be spending some money maintaining this facility, and we've really put it off because it just seems nonsensical to invest a lot of maintenance dollars in this facility. So we have an estimate of $12 million in needed maintenance for this building. Some of it is near term, like painting the facade, but you can't paint the facade without repairing the plaster. You can't repair the plaster without fixing the windows. Then you need to replace the windows. So it escalates very quickly. The $12 million figure is over time, right? So in a few years, we have a cost estimate for replacing the roof. That's not something we need to do tomorrow, but definitely some decisions on investing real dollars in this facility need to be made in the near term.
More comments about the mayor's motion. Mr. Bryson?
Can I get a 2-minute at ease, please?
Yes, 2-minute at ease. Okay, we're back in order. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess we're going to continue the discussion on this, and I'm going to withdraw my motion because some people have made some good points during the 2-minute recess, so I'll withdraw my motion. I think Mr. Bryson has.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I move that to direct staff to draft an ordinance to introduce a general obligation bond to put before the voters on the October 22 municipal election of a dollar amount up to 41.248 million. We'll leave that as the motion. Did I say enough? I would like to speak to the motion. So the concern was that we were worried that the public was not in, has not bought into the idea of a new city hall. That would be the concern. If we asked the public, hey, we need a new city hall. Our old one's too old. We rent space all over town. We want to build a new city hall. I strongly believe that the public would support that. The last time that the public had this opportunity was a new police department, and they agreed to it. And the dollar figures were as high as the dollar figures that we're talking now, maybe slightly less, but inflationary, that we'd be talking about the same size of project, and the public knew it was the right direction. As we get on here, they expect us to learn things and find out how the city government works. And out of all the things we do, the one thing I saw that we did the worst was City Hall. The fact that we are paying almost $1 million a year in rent for a business that's in business forever is probably the most fundamentally inaccurate thing that we're doing that we could correct for the long-term benefit of every single level of Juneau, every aspect of Juneau life will benefit from us doing City Hall correctly when we're talking Juneau as an ongoing, forever living entity. If we correct City Hall so that we're not paying rent for city services, we will be doing the most justice to Juneau, to our next generation, our children's kids. It's just like, out of all the things that I've done here on the assembly, I was the most proud that we have the opportunity to correct City Hall, because I thought it was the thing that we did the least accurate. So I'm going to leave my conversation with that. I'm really excited that we have an opportunity to correct City Hall. And I believe that if we get the last bit of discussion out of the way, I believe the community will support this. Thank
Okay,
you.
we're Madam Mayor, then Mr. Smith and Ms. Hale.
Thank you. So I guess the question comes to, when is a good time to have a general obligation bond vote on the ballot? And as I said, it's tough to bring the public along, but I was reminded that it's still June and we have time to continue to educate the public. And I'll be quite honest, Ms. Kester's talking about painting the building, and that would entail getting new windows. And I have friends that have just got new windows. They're about $5,000 a piece, and there's a lot of windows here. So I have switched mine, and I would support Mr. Bryson's motion.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Objecting for the purpose of a question, and that is, what do we know about commercial office space
Apologize
trends?
for-
No
yeah.
problem. Thank you. This is the more appropriate time now. Thank you.
Ms. Kester.
Thank you for that question. Well, taking into account that I'm neither an economist or a real estate professional, we did answer some of those questions, I feel like, in our site selection search, where we really were looking for a vacant facility of an approximate square foot size. And what happened is we'd see some, and then they would get scooped up by other entities, Central Council being one. Search, of course, has been scooping up a lot of property. So the market for those facilities has been relatively hot as of late. We've also approached facilities like, where the permanent fund is housed, and said, hey, would you be interested in selling? And no one is. So that makes me think that for that size of a building, there is relatively relative demand. We also did, of course, talk with the state and the state leasing officer about, their near-term, any near-term visions to consolidate and free up space. And they said that they have kind of turned over that leaf. So, that would be the indicators as part of this project that make me think that we still have a robust, large office building market here.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So all along, we've been striving to do kind of apples to apples comparisons of various ideas and options. I think what's clear is the best long-term solution is something that is purpose-built for what we do. Are there going to be buildings out there for sale? Certainly, but are they going to be in new condition? Are they going to be energy efficient? Are they going to be easy to maintain? Are they going to be built to meet our needs? No. Are they going to take high renovation costs? Yes. Are there going to be building owners out there who would love to rent us office space for decades more? You bet. We've been renting office space for at least 30 years. So, the commercial market, I think, moves around. I think there's probably an excess of office space out there right now.
Sure.
But every time we look at options that are in front of us, none of them seem desirable or like good long-term bets.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'd like to object for purposes of a question. And I don't know if this question is of the maker of the motion or perhaps Ms. Kester or Mr. Watt. I think it's up to $41.5 million. If the ordinance were drafted with that amount, would that be the question that would go before the voters? Or, for example, or perhaps Mr. Attorney, if we were to forward fund or pay down some of those costs, would we be able to send a smaller amount to the voters? I mean, what discretion do we have if that ordinance is drafted in that way? Thank you. And I'll remove my objection.
Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. So the current motion that I understand is for an ordinance to go to the voters for $441.284 million. So that's what would go to the voters if this body wants to make that number smaller, you would have to put cash into that analysis to make the GO bond smaller.
Ms. Hale.
When do we have to make that decision about putting cash to make it smaller?
I think Mr. Bryson's trying to say up to, because we're not sure the number, and get something drafted. Mr. Watt.
Deputy Mayor, so the ordinance introduction date would have to be that meeting in July, which I think is July 11th. Just checking, July 11th for public hearing on August 1st. The subtlety here, I think, is in going to the voters, we are asking for authorization to issue debt for an amount. So the question for the voters, the up to doesn't really matter to the voters. We would be saying, voters, can we incur this amount of debt? Yes, no. In other instances where we do appropriation ordinances where the assembly is unsure on its willingness to expend on a particular issue, we've introduced ordinances up to and given you the flexibility to scale that back. But the question to the voters is a little bit different. It's a question of authority. So the question is, how much authority do you want to ask for the voters? You could ask for more authority than you need, thinking that you would put general fund in there, but that doesn't help persuade the voters. So you have to decide before we introduce whatever ordinance on July 11th, whether or not you're going to put sales tax in. And we have two possible pending ideas. One is the ordinance on Monday, the 13th, next Monday. We've introduced an ordinance for 6.3 million of general fund, which would reduce that amount, and you could vote yes, no on Monday. And the other is whether you think reducing the cost of the project in the 1% is a good strategy or not. So we have to sort that out before we put anything on the ballot.
And let me just ask the maker of the motion. My understanding is you were just trying to say up to for now, and you didn't intend to go say up to 41 to the voters. We would, before it went to the voters. Sorry, did you?
Sorry, thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I would like to have a more fine-tuned number that would present an accurate number to the voters so that they could have accurate information to make their vote on. And I anticipated that we would have more discussion. The purpose of my motion was to keep this on track to
That's-
be on the October ballot.
That's what I understood, that he didn't mean 41 that would go on the ballot question. It was just a
Up to.
placeholder to
Thank you.
keep it going. Right? Okay. Ms. Treem and then Mayor Weldon.
Thank you. I'm going to probably ask a different version of the same question because it's confusing. So we are trying to make a decision tonight with this motion about whether we're moving forward with the process to put this on the ballot. But we have a pending decision next Monday. So how do we do it? How do we make the decision tonight, not knowing what the outcome is going to be on Monday?
Exactly. We would have to have a meeting to get something before July 11th. I'm sure there's meetings, right? Madam, Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So I think what you're trying to decide tonight is whether or not to move forward to put it on the ballot. And the amount that we would put on and if you vote yes, the amount would be adjusted on Monday, potentially, if you approve that general fund amount, and then potentially adjusted again if we include it in the sales tax, which adds some complexity of you have to think through the voters voting yes, 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 no, no, yes, no, no, all the outcomes. But I think the motion probably is direct preparation of an ordinance for a GO bond amount as determined through Assembly Committee process over the next several weeks.
Mr. Bryson, would you like to amend your motion?
That's exactly what I meant to say.
That's what I thought you meant to say. It really is, actually. Okay, more discussion on this motion. Mr. Smith, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I will object to the motion. I appreciate all the work we've been doing on New City Hall. I think the need is apparent. I guess I just have concerns that as we're emerging from a extremely disruptive pandemic that has changed life as we know it for many, including the way we work, and people are still kind of trying to get their feet under them. And anyway, I think there is just, people are anxious about how things are going to go forward, a lot of unknowns. I think a $40 million bond question is just maybe a bit too much. I appreciate the work that's been done. I just don't think now is the right time.
Madam Mayor, I apologize. You were next.
Thank you. The other thing we could do if we didn't want to just move it and refine it later is just send another motion forward. And just so everybody's, I just did a quick math. If you take 41, 248 minus 6.3, it drops it down to 34.9. So that's a big significant difference right there.
More comments on the motion? Mr. Watt?
The Deputy Mayor, and just to clarify, I think Mr. Smith raised some questions. There's a piece of the presentation we didn't get to. So there is our debt mill levy, which is rapidly declining. So certainly voters are sensitive, and certainly the economy has been very difficult. But we find ourselves in a position where you could fund a new city hall and quite a bit more by maintaining flat taxes. It is a rare golden opportunity to do a good deed for the long term at a flat and stable rate. So Mr. Rogers sent me an email earlier in the day. In his email, just to clarify, he said, under any scenario, approving GO debt for new city hall will not increase the mill rate above the current 1.2 rate And it will leave plenty of headroom for other geo debts, schools, other projects, et cetera, without raising the mill rate above the current 1.2.
Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just would like to add to that on the first page of the memo that you were presented, taking these difficult questions in descending order. There are some nice scenarios that Director Rogers laid out. He did use numbers, not including not including parking underneath, but there's basically 3 options there that vary on the amount of general fund or sales tax dollars that the city wants to dedicate to the project. And those have a mill rate equivalent associated with them. Again, that would, so if you put in 12.6 million, which is approving the 1% and the fund balance under the scenario 3, that's 0.19 mil that you would be using in debt service. So remember, we're paying almost $1 million in rent, so we can take that off the table. It's actually a higher number than in this table because that was last year's numbers. So you would add the 0.19 to that that chart in fiscal year 24, and then still have that headroom available for other projects, just to point you to where some of that math has been worked out.
Madam Mayor.
So just to clarify, if we used any of these, so let's just take the biggest 1.34, we would add that to the 0.69 rather than the 1.2. Is that correct?
Deputy Mayor, just to clarify, 0.34, not 1.34. So correct, except that we would also reduce our costs by the nearly $1 million a year that we pay in rent. So there would be some feathering in over time, but the not paying rent substantially pays the debt for the project. But if we're going to incur the debt, we have to inform the voters of the amount of debt that we would incur on their behalf.
Okay, I'm going to make a comment. I'm with Mr. Smith. Just at the very last minute, we're like 0.3, 0.2. We're still trying to figure all this out. And I think voters, if they don't understand it and they don't really think it, they say, no, I'm worried about the 1%. I've never been worried about the 1%. It's always passes, but people are feeling a lot of stress. And I just don't think it's the time to ask them to spend 30 or 40 million on the city hall. More comments about the motion. Ms. Huskandis.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'll just keep it really short. I understand the trepidation, but I will say that last comment and that explanation, that's what we need to get out there. People are shocked that we rent. So those who don't pay a lot of attention to the city business. So when you say how much we waste in rent and you tell them how much of the debt that pays, I think most people, even though it's a stressful time, will support this.
Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. And Mr. Bryson, please correct me if I'm wrong. I have the motion as you amended it with the removal of the amount to be replaced with amount to be determined. So the motion to direct staff to draft an ordinance to be placed on the October 2022 election ballot towards the new city hall with the amount to be determined. Is that accurate? Thank you. Mr. Bryson?
Yes.
Ms. Hale?
Yes.
Ms. Huskandis?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Ms. Treem?
Yes.
Ms. Wall?
Yes.
Walofsky Doc?
Yes.
Ms. Gladysevsky?
No.
And Mayor Weldon?
Yes.
Motion passes
Okay.
7-2.
I think we're done, right?
We have one more item.
We do?
If we are done talking business.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Cathcart is helping me.
Oh, yes. Yay. We just, for those of you who are listening on the radio or on the Zoom or wherever you're listening, we just gave flowers to Miss Eustanis for her birthday. And we sang offline to prevent you all from hearing. Having nothing further, you have something?
You're gonna adjourn.
Okay, or nothing further, we're adjourned.
Okay.